Good evening and welcome to Thursdays with NAMI. My name is Peg Morrison. I'll be your host tonight. I am the Assistant Director of NAMI North Carolina. That's the National Alliance on Mental Illness, North Carolina. I'm so glad y'all are here. Thursdays with NAMI is our way of building conversations and building community around the topic of mental health. And unfortunately, we know that mental health challenges overlap a great deal with the justice system. Tonight, we'll be talking about solitary confinement, the practice of holding an incarcerated person away from human contact of any kind, really away from stimulation. They can't even have a book for all but an hour or two a day. This complete isolation causes mental health problems, regardless of what your status was when you went in. Unfortunately, folks with mental illness and the BIPOC community, that's Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, are much more likely than the average bear to be sentenced to jail or prison. Once they get there, they are much more likely to end up in solitary confinement. A study in New York City found that inmates with mental illness were 3 times more likely to be held in isolation. Blacks and Hispanics are also well overrepresented in segregation, while their white counterparts, of course, are not. They are underrepresented. So it appears discrimination is a big factor in who gets sent to the hole and who's incarcerated to begin with, and then who ends up in the worst situation possible. But even if it was applied fairly, really, should anyone experience solitary confinement? Moreover, why does it happen so often in North Carolina? We'll be examining these questions with our very knowledgeable panel in just another minute. As usual, the first part of our show will be an interview with our guests. Partway through, we'll show a video of the week. In this case, it's a very compelling testimony from someone who has been in solitary confinement and what it did to him. And then we'll spend time answering questions from you, members of our virtual studio audience on Zoom and Facebook. First, we'll have a word from our sponsors. Thursdays with NAMI is funded in part by the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services through the Federal Community Mental Health Block Grant Fund. We so appreciate their guidance and their support. Now, without any further ado, I have to confess, I asked y'all for bios, but with 4 panelists, I don't want to be reading a half hour. So this is kind of abbreviated from what you gave me. Introductions. Sierra Cobb is a family advocate with Emancipate North Carolina. Drew Dahl is the re-entry coordinator at the Religious Coalition for a Nonviolent Durham. Let's see. How did I lose my place here? Susan Pollitt is a supervising attorney for Disability Rights North Carolina, and Luke Woollard is an attorney for Disability Rights North Carolina as well. Don't ever hit paste twice, because then you'll get really confused when you look at the list of names. All right, so questions for everybody on the panel in whatever order you'd like. We'd love to hear about the backstory, what brought you into the field, what brought you here tonight. Tell us your story in a nutshell. Maybe Sierra, would you mind going first?
Sure. Hey, my name's Sierra and I work for Emancipate. What brought me to fighting for justice is my husband is currently incarcerated in North Carolina on a 25 to 32 year sentence. He was overly sentenced and wrongfully convicted. It started with advocating for him and his freedom. And then I realized that he wasn't the only one experiencing wrongful conviction and prosecutorial misconduct. So it just kind of ballooned from there. And then just really advocating for families who have someone incarcerated because of the things that I've had to deal with. And so something just told me that this was my passion and this is my purpose. And so this is why I'm here today.
All right, thank you. Who would like to go next?
Well, I'll jump in. All right. Yeah, I'm Drew. I had about a 20-year career in business. And by the end of that, but right before I got locked up, I was a miserable human being in however you want to use the word miserable, pretty much every definition. So as I came out of prison, one of the things I knew I wanted to do was live a life of amends. and how do I try to atone for what my life was before. And I found that in first in working in Durham Economic Resource Center, which did job development for people with barriers to employment. And then about 2012, 2013, I had the opportunity to move into reentry work. And I've been doing that with the Religious Coalition ever since.
All right. Well, it sounds like you've had a wonderful career of service. And
So
next.
I'll go next. I'm Susan Paula with Disability Rights North Carolina, and I followed my father and mother into the legal profession and into the area of civil rights, and fell into doing criminal defense work, where you meet people who, some of whom end up in prison. I continue to communicate with them and learn about their conditions in prison. I learned about the research regarding the terrible effects of solitary confinement, and then as the protection and advocacy system for people with disabilities in North Carolina, which Disability Rights is, Luke and I are able to go in and actually witness the conditions of solitary confinement in many of the North Carolina institutions. And I think once you see that and meet people and hear about it, you can't walk away. Thank you.
Thank you. We have so many committed individuals up here, all of you.
Yeah, my name's Luke Woollard. During law school and then coming out of law school, I knew I wanted to do, public interest law. Thought I was going to go into trial defense, and ended up working for some public defender's offices, but ended up at the North Carolina Center on Actual Innocence, analyzing folks' cases for things like prosecutorial misconduct, really police misconduct, and trying to get out the folks who we felt, we had the resources to help. Pretty much along every step of that way, I tended to see more and more the reforms that needed to happen, the problems with the prison system in our country in general, and especially with solitary confinement. I came to disability rights in 2019. And admittedly had to teach myself a little bit of disability law as well, but I've enjoyed it. And especially the access that we have at these institutions, where I feel like we can really, experience it. We get access to protect folks, and we can, to the degree that the law allows, shine a light into these institutions that so few people know anything about.
All right. Well, just listening to each of you tell your story of why you're here, how you got pulled into this, it really touches my heart, and I'm sure the heart of our listeners, that you're focusing on people who struggle and are powerless, and you didn't have to. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for your good work. So Drew, you have personally experienced solitary confinement, from what I understand. Can you tell us what that was like and how you kept your sanity? And don't forget to unmute.
Dude, yeah, technology is great when it works. Yeah, I spent a year straight in solitary. Initially enraged. I would be screaming in my cell, "You've got to let me out of here." Going from actually being able to talk to people and see people, and where you don't see anybody except the guard that brings you meals 3 times a day, and you can't talk to anybody, was just maddening. And then eventually it becomes extraordinarily disorienting. You lose track of time. For a while, the only way I knew what day it was is because out of the window of the cell I was in, I could see the little church building, and you could tell when it was Sunday, because people were going in and out of their church. At some point, the people that ran the facility decided to paint over the windows of the folks in solitary. So at that point, I had no idea what day it was, because you don't get you don't get newspapers, you don't get any of that. You just, it's, yeah, I mean, massively, massively depressing. To the extent that you could say I kept my sanity, which may be debatable, but what saved me was there was a guard that was kind of consistent throughout that year, and he would bring me books, and he really wasn't supposed to, but he would slide me books, and so I had something to read. And if he hadn't done that, I don't know what I would have done, because you can only sit and stare at the walls so much. So yeah, it was excruciating. And I would have, if I'd had the opportunity, I would have pled to or done anything to get out solitary, which at times makes me wonder, just how much is that used to get what the system wants out of you. Is if we make your life hellish enough, you'll agree to anything. But yeah, so that was my experience.
Definitely see the potential for a manipulation tool there. Boy, it seems arbitrarily cruel to paint over the windows. Wow.
Boy, didn't it? And there was never any, I mean, at least in general pop, you can, if you're on the yard, you can kind of ask what's going on, and there are always, generally there's a guard somewhere that will kind of tell you, even if it's all to the side. The problem in solitary is you have no ability to talk to anybody other than that one guard coming around. And, just how do you know what's going on? Nobody will tell you. Yeah. Just a sense of, why did you do this to me? And then there'd be times where, you're supposed to have the lights turned off at some point. They'll leave the lights on all night. I mean, you hear about stuff that's been done in countries that we think of as extraordinarily oppressive. And you say, well, we'd never do that in the US. Yeah, we do that in the US all the time. We just do it to people that don't have a voice to express their how badly they're being treated.
Well, that sums it up. So Sierra, you told me the story of how you were hired, which I loved. You called an organization and talked about your situation, and they said, we need you as a family advocate. If I got that right, that's a great story. You work with families of folks who are justice involved. What toll do you see incarceration taking on the family's mental health? How does it affect loved ones on the outside?
I see people with high depression, high anxiety. I see children with emotional disorders, emotional detachment, because they don't have a parent. Even to as far as physical, it can affect your physical health, because the loss of a loved one, whether they're in the ground or whether they're incarcerated, can physically affect your health. And I've seen people have physical elements due to a loved one being incarcerated. So it takes a toll. Like, it can really exacerbate if you have mental health issues, and it can exacerbate it even worse. And especially for children, the children get the brunt of it. And I feel like that's why a lot of them have behavioral issues in school, is because they don't have a parent, and their parent is missing, and they can't, I hear a lot of people say, well, at least you can hear their voice. But if they're in solitary confinement, you can't hear anything. You can't, sometimes they won't even let you write. Or sometimes I've heard where you can have one phone call a year. And I think once a year, you can have meat on your plate. Like, that's just how demoralizing it is. I also hear they have roaches and rats and ants that's crawling over them at night. And when they take them out for rec, they put them literally in dog cages to stand there for 2 hours to be outside. And it just baffles me how they don't want our animals to be in cages, but it's okay to put our humans in cages and leave them there in all types of inhumane conditions. My husband was just actually thrown in solitary confinement on Monday after he was stabbed for their negligence of letting somebody else out that was in solitary confinement and has been in there for a while and didn't want to come back to general population, and probably made that known that he didn't want to come back, because every time he comes out, he's harmed somebody to go back in. And this time he harmed my husband, and they threw my husband in the hole with a laceration on his head. He said he had no pillow to sleep on. He said there was roaches, there was rats, and he was only there for 24 hours because I was able to do something about it. But just that experience of being traumatized, almost losing your life, getting stabbed in the top of your head because of their negligence and then thrown straight in the hole, and you had nothing to do with it. It wasn't even your fault. It was very traumatizing for him. He's still trying to deal with it. It was very traumatizing for me because when I called the facility, they told me he wasn't in the hole and they wouldn't give me any information on him. So I didn't know until I called the warden the next morning, and he called me and told me the story of what happened. So it's very heartbreaking. I cried all night, just not knowing how your loved one is and their mental state and their well-being, because you know that they're not taking care of them at all. And then them being in a small cell that is maybe no bigger than your bathroom, with nothing, no pillow, no nothing. And you're lucky if you get books. So it's really hard to even keep your sanity in a four-wall, all white four walls. Just, it feels like it's closing in on you. So it's hard. It's hard on them, and it's definitely hard on the families. I'm one to experience it. So it's, and I have PTSD, and it sends my PTSD sometimes in a whirlwind, just having to deal with that and other people experiencing the same thing.
Well, it takes a lot of courage to share all that you've been through and what your loved one, your husband, has been through. I'm glad he has you as an advocate on the outside. So many people don't. And I didn't realize it makes sense that you could have someone on the outside call and advocate for you, and that would make a difference. Wow, that's a lot. That's a lot.
I do what I do. That's why I'm here, to help other families, because sometimes when they call, they don't hear their voice because they feel like their voice is not even important either because they have somebody incarcerated. So it takes somebody like me or Dawn to call and say, hey, what's going on? We demand to know what's going on. And that's why I do what I do, to help other people amplify their voices in situations like this.
Yeah. Thank you for that work. And Luke, you've written about your work with folks in solitary and how it's described as the size of a parking lot. The cells are described as that, but that gives you the sense of a big expansive parking lot, not a little caged in area that happens to be the size of a parking lot. Tell us about your experiences.
Sure. You know, and everything Sierra said is very true. I'd add that sometimes they can shackle you during your quote unquote rec time in this cage if they feel it's necessary. I won't talk too long about sort of the conditions. I think there are people on this panel who can talk about it much better than I can, but the immediate thing that I think struck me, and I would think strikes most people when you go into one of these cell blocks, is you're sort of immediately disabused of any notion that you had from seeing, you know, movies or TV about what prison is and about what solitary is. You know, rec's a great example. You think rec, you know, oh, Shawshank Redemption, they're out in the yard, they're out in the green grass under the sun, and that's just not the case. It is really just and even the cells are, you know, cages made of cement blocks, an open toilet that's also your sink. That's the same place where you eat, you know, sleep, exercise, do pretty much everything in your life with, you know, if you're lucky, you know, 3 showers a week and some rec time. I will say some things about the folks that we've talked to that surprised me when we started really going and doing monitoring, or at least I started. Susie's been doing this for a very long time, but things that struck me were just the compassion that the folks who are in solitary have for one another. I mean, we often get letters, and here when we're monitoring, you know, we're going around talking to folks, and they'll tell us, hey, you also need to check on this person who's a couple, you know, cells down. You know, we hear them yelling, we hear them throwing stuff. We're worried about them. Please go check on them. That always astounded me, because here's a person probably the worst place that you can be put, and they're worried about other folks. Also, just the self-awareness that many folks have about what's happening to them, what's happening to their mental health. You know, we heard from one young man who was about to be released, but he was still in long-term solitary confinement. And all he was asking us was, you know, please, I would like to speak to a social worker, a psychologist, somebody, which under DPS policy, he's supposed to speak to those people, and he hadn't. he said just something because he knew he was not ready to go out. He had been in solitary for a very long time and he just wanted, someone to help him to readjust. So that self-awareness struck me. I will say at an institutional level, doing the research and knowing what we know, it is surprising to me how much we know and how undisputed it is in psychological research and even in the law that solitary is torture and that everyone mentally decompensates and that as the Fourth Circuit said, there's a substantial risk of serious psychological harm. I mean, the year that I started at Disability Rights, the Fourth Circuit basically came out, summarized 30 years of psychological research for a case up in Virginia and said, yeah, substantial risk of psychological harm. I believe the quote was toxic to brain functioning. And you'll see that from the last 30 years of psych research. And despite that, we still see mental health, professionals and sort of folks at all levels of the prison system who sort of, allow this to exist, who we know are trying to work within a very difficult system, but, you see making choices that, like allowing custody staff to determine when someone can and cannot have a visit, the visit they're supposed to have with their psychiatrist. Being all right because they have to be with, speaking, having, conversations with their clients at the cell door where the guards and pretty much anyone who want to listen can hear. Right on up to leadership level where we had, folks high up sort of in the mental health statewide apparatus at DPS working with folks at UNC to put out these studies, two of them recently, both of which show, one of which showed the significant harms that folks, once they're released, face, the high mortality rates they face if they've experienced solitary confinement compared to folks who don't. And another one that said, if we get these folks out of solitary and put them in specialized units where they actually get mental health care that they need and they're not in these super restrictive conditions, they fare so much better. Less risk of suicide, less risk of self-harm, less risk of getting infractions. So I think it is frustrating that we know this and it's well accepted. At least I rarely hear from prison officials that solitary isn't harmful to anybody and that it's fine. Now it's just sort of an institutional momentum of, well, but it's there. And, we hear, safety, we hear it's costly to sort of revamp or get rid of solitary. So I think for me, that really just is a constant reminder that you have to work at both levels. You need to, if you're an advocate or a mental health professional, you need to, in my opinion, help the client in the system that they're in. If we go in monitoring and we see somebody who's not getting the meds that they need, or even, not getting the physical accommodations that they need for their disability, that's something where we have to work within the system that is there to get that person help as soon as we can. But you can't forget that you have to work to change the institutional level as well, because at the end of the day, most, if not all of these symptoms and these harms that are happening to people and, the mental illness that's getting worse, or the folks that are, presenting with new disorders since they've been in solitary, all of that is because of long-term solitary confinement. And you have to treat the symptoms as they come up, yes, but you need to look at the underlying cause as well, and really try and fix that. And that sort of, at least has pushed me towards, the idea of the Mandela rules and just, abolition in its entirety of long-term solitary confinement, because we've seen compromises and attempts to do compromise or get a certain population out of solitary confinement in the past, and usually it involves some loophole that allows that institutional momentum to just keep going where it's going, and you continue to see folks with serious mental illness in solitary confinement, and you continue to see just too many people in solitary confinement in North Carolina.
There's a lot to unpack there. That was a great summary. And it always occurs to me that you could go into incarceration with reasonably good mental health, and probably even in the best of circumstances, you're going to have some trauma. You go in with mental illness, you go in a person of color, you're probably going to have more trauma. Seems to be what the statistics point to, unfortunately. Susan, what policy or other changes are needed in North Carolina regarding solitary confinement?
Well, that's easy to answer because we need to eliminate long-term solitary confinement. Many other states have done it, some by legislative action, some by prison administrative action. We have a great opportunity here in North Carolina because Governor Cooper's own task force on racial equity and criminal justice has recommended the elimination of long-term solitary confinement. And they also recommended that there be a transparent committee with academicians, people with lived experience, prison administrators to come together and discuss and resolve the way that we use solitary confinement in North Carolina that's hurting so many people. This was a recommendation that came out at the very end of 2020. It's not a recommendation that has been prioritized during the time since then, but we're not going to leave that alone. We're going to continue to advocate that Governor Cooper take this action. He can do it. It's an executive agency. DPS is. There's nothing that requires this overuse and cruel sanction of long-term solitary confinement. And that is just one of the latest committees and organizations that has recommended to North Carolina the elimination of long-term solitary confinement. Tragically, Mr. Kerr died in 2014 in solitary confinement at Alexander Correctional Institution when he was in a psychiatric breakdown, and they had chained him. They put him in shackles and handcuffs, and he wasn't able to come and get food or nourishment. And by the time they took him out of the cell several days later, he was, I'm sorry to say this, but dead on arrival at the central prison from dehydration. So at that point, we brought in some experts. We asked then Commissioner Geis of DPS to bring in some national experts, and they recommended that anybody with mental illness who's identified as somebody with mental illness in DPS come out of their cell in solitary confinement for 10 hours a week of structured therapeutic programming and 10 hours a week of unstructured time. This is a settlement that's sometimes ordered by a court or reached by parties in other parts of the country. And we've not been able to manage that. The most we've done is create some therapeutic diversion units with at most 180 beds. We have I think over 700 people who are identified with mental illness in long-term solitary confinement in North Carolina. The other thing, so that expert recommended an internal DPS committee that included academicians in 2015, recommended that. The Vera Institute of Justice came in and did a year-long study of our long-term solitary confinement and has recommended that in 2016. So we know what to do. Other states have done it. Top-level prison administrators have testified that they can run safe prisons without long-term solitary confinement. So we urge everybody to join us in advocating for Governor Cooper to take this step. Thanks.
All right. Yeah, I sure hope to see that. I've seen some headlines about disability rights work and advocacy for that. So it does sound like low-hanging fruit almost.
I think it will take some funding, but it's smart funding. It will make the prison safer for the people who are there, living there and work there. It will make our communities safer for when people come out. It's just an easy decision, I think, for the legislature.
Next question goes to Sierra. Your organization, Emancipate North Carolina, focuses on incarceration in general, mass incarceration. What would you like to see changed in the justice system in general here?
I would like to see the outlook of legislators and the people who run the head of DPS change their outlook on how we are treating people who are incarcerated and shift from a prison mind perspective of torture and punishment to more of a real rehabilitative and mental health services for them instead of just punishment and torture. And there's plenty of ways that could be done. Legislation can be changed. Stuff inside of DPS, higher DPS can be changed, which we're currently trying to work on something of that nature. So really just their outlook, because they have a really biased outlook. They feel like if you do the crime, you do the time, and that you're subjected to extreme punishment. As the 13th Amendment says, slavery is abolished unless you commit a crime. And they feel like if you commit a crime, they can treat you any kind of way. So that has to change. Their whole mind frame has to change and move away from the 1960s to re-innovate the system like they have over there in Europe. They don't even operate nowhere like the US does when it comes to the prison system. They have an oversight board for their corrections. They actually have, their cells aren't cells. They have regular beds, and they have weekly family visits. So they don't deprive them of necessary human rights that they should have as a human, even though they committed a crime.
Wow, I like all of that. I know, I'm aware that in Europe they do a better job with rehabilitation. And it's just never struck me, if someone needs to make a change, I can't see how dehumanizing them is going to get you there. Any follow-up comments from other panelists? That's kind of a question that I'd like to hear from all of you on, if you have something to share.
Well, I think one of the things when we talk about solitary, when we talk about what needs to change, is, many people's impression is solitary is used if you have committed an act of violence on state. Well, they're going to put you in the hole. I saw way, way more people in solitary because they had been a victim of violence. And to say, well, to protect you, we're not punishing you by solitary, we're putting you in protective solitary. So not only have you been a victim of violence to begin with, now you are mentally tortured because you were a victim of violence. And I mean, depending on the facility I was in, I spent a year, I never went outside. I never had any rec time. I got a half an hour, a couple of days a week to take a shower. And most of the time you're shackled while you're taking a shower. Try to get, think about being wrists and legs, and you're trying to undress, take a shower, and get dressed again. Yes, embarrassing, dehumanizing. You're terrified that you're going to get sick or you're going to get injured somehow, and no one's going to check on you. So when we think about what we need to change, this idea that we can use segregation to protect people. No, we're torturing people who are victims already. Or there's been some kind of disturbance or a fight, and what we're going to do is pick up everybody and throw them into solitary and wait for somebody to break and take the blame for it. Solitary should not be used at all, but it especially should not be used to punish people who are already victims.
Yeah, and I agree with Drew and would say, from a DPS policy standpoint, you do not need to have gotten an infraction to go into the highest levels of segregation. They just need to think that you're dangerous. It's off topic, but I'm happy to talk about how racial bias can creep into that particular determination that you are dangerous. Same thing for getting off of these units. When your review comes up, you can be infraction free and still just not be at the hearing, just get a little pink slip that says, we decided you still need to stay here. In terms of rehabilitation, I would say that rehabilitation really is impossible if you're in solitary. I don't know, without programming, without interaction, without something, I don't know how you're supposed to even take the first step towards rehabilitation. And indeed, you're going to take several steps back because you will, probably come out having mentally decompensated in some way. Even healthy, mentally healthy folks who go in there, that's going to happen to them. And I do want to stress that, rehabilitation is so important because the vast majority of these folks who experience solitary and long-term solitary are coming home. People tend to think that, well, this is lifers or folks on death row only. absolutely not true. People who experience solitaire are going to rejoin their communities. And if they are able to rehabilitate, and if we had a system that focused on that, those communities might be, better for that. But too often, folks don't have a chance to rehabilitate. It is not the goal of the system to rehabilitate, and they end up, sometimes even coming straight off of years of solitary, trying to then rejoin communities. And we see the negative effects, in that study that was done on the North Carolina population that just said mortality is just skyrockets if people have experienced any sort of restrictive housing. I say restrictive housing, that's what they call solitary confinement in the prison system. So yeah, we try and shift the narrative towards needing rehabilitation at any point. And really a big part of that is we need to eliminate long-term solitary confinement.
I would be interested. I know, Susan, you have something to contribute to, but I would be interested in hearing a minute about the implicit bias and the impact of race on that, because that is relevant.
Yeah, so this first came up, and when I say solitary confinement is racist or used in a racist manner, you don't have to take my word for it. We've been studying statistics of who is and isn't in restrictive housing for a couple years now. And while the North Carolina population tends to be about 30% people of color, 70% white, the North Carolina regular prison population tends to be about 60% people of color, 40% white folks. Now, even considering that regular population is like a baseline, when you get into restrictive housing, and for folks who don't know, there's about 4 levels of restrictive housing. They all are solitary confinement. They are all your 23 hours a day, but folks get some privileges. Sometimes you'll get access to a radio or something. But as you go up in the more and more and more restrictive categories of these, the ratio of how many people of color are in there compared to white people goes up and up and up until you reach HCON, high security max control, where you have, currently this week between 80 to 85% of the folks in there are people of color, overwhelmingly young men. When I say young, I'm like under 30. And so statistically, if we look at that, especially even compared to the regular prison population, racial bias is creeping into these decisions. And it creeps in several ways. One, that determination of dangerousness, like I was talking about, you don't even need an infraction. If we think you're dangerous, we'll put you in. And if we consider you dangerous, less likely that you'll get out. And there are psychological studies really showing that, folks, Black and white, tend to, because of implicit bias, think that people of color are both, more threatening and also more likely to be culpable for their crimes. There was a study, I think, done on, children or adolescents of color that said, we're just more likely to hold children of color more responsible for the things they do. So that sort of bias is going to creep in when we're talking about dangerousness. It's also going to creep in for the infractions. A lot of the infractions in DPS are not, assault or, possession of something. Some of them are very vague. It's, having something that could be determined to be used in an escape attempt. Okay, what is that? I have sheets, I can tie them together and throw them out the window. A huge one that a lot of people get is disobey an order. Everything if you're in prison, first of all, everything is an order. And if you disobey an order, it is then probably going to be up to the CO to determine, okay, well, was that, just they couldn't hear me, or was that a direct disobeying of an order? For example, we work with people with disabilities. We've seen it a couple times where someone hard of hearing or deaf is threatened with infractions when they had their back turned to a CO and the CO was yelling at them. They can't read lips, they can't do anything. They threaten them with disobey order. So we have these infractions that are incredibly subjective and based on what the COs think is the situation at the time. And that's just another place for that implicit bias to really creep in. So the system that, puts people into solitary confinement and then determines when they can leave has so many instances where, the racial implicit bias can creep into the people who are making these decisions. And you see it played out in the statistics, reliably time and time again, like we talked about. And really one of the reasons that we need, just abolition of long-term solitary confinement is because of how damaging it is and how much the implicit bias can play a role in what puts people there. I am all for eliminating implicit bias or trying to do that in the prison policies that lead to this, but really knowing what we know and seeing the statistics, we really need to eliminate this punishment that is used that is so detrimental to just really every single aspect of the person, since we know that implicit bias is creeping into the system in these ways.
That was an excellent explanation. Thank you. Susan, thank you for your patience.
I was going to talk about the race as well. The statistics we have from just the other week and just to echo what Luke was saying, in HCON, this terrible unit that was built to replicate the high security maximum control of the federal prison in Colorado. We built it on the campus of a youth camp, now called Granville, up near Butner. But in this HCON unit, there were last week 64 people of color and 12 white people. And if you're assigned to HCON, you're generally there at least a year and sometimes 2. And the way it's designed, it's even more isolated from human contact than other segregation units in the state. There are 2 people under 21 or under in HCON last week. And there were 54 21 and under in solitary confinement last week. It's especially damaging for young people who need large muscle movement, exercise, nutrition, stimulation, treatment. We've really got to do something about that. I think that's that low-hanging fruit, like you said. Let's stop solitary confinement for people 21 and under.
Those are heartbreaking numbers. Any follow-up, Sierra, Drew? Okay, well, let's move along. Drew, you run a program that creates social support for individuals after they're released from prison. Tell us about that. How many of your participants are recovering from solitary confinement?
So our support teams are around relationships. We're not trying to fix anybody or change anybody. We're just trying to be really good friends. And we operate really from 2 imperatives. The first is infinite belonging. Everybody belongs. And it's not that everybody deserves to belong, because that implies that there is possibility that you don't, but we ought to let you in. Everybody belongs. And our responsibility, our job, our whatever, is to make a space for everybody. So it doesn't matter, what you've done or what your life has been or how long you've been in prison. You belong, and you have a right. You belong in our community. You are part of our community. The other imperative is boundless compassion. Nobody has offended so greatly that they're outside the grace of God, that they're outside the grace of community. One of the things we talk about a lot is, I want to be forgiven for everything I've done. I want generally the people that are around me, that I'm friends with, I want them to be forgiven. Well, if I want forgiveness, then I have to extend forgiveness. I don't get any more than what I'm willing to give. So our compassion has to extend. It doesn't mean that we don't have boundaries. It doesn't mean that we don't recognize that, I embezzled boatloads of money. You probably ought not to give me your checkbook. But that doesn't mean you can't love me and that I can't love you. So that's what we form our teams around, is belonging and compassion and expressing love. It's tough for people coming home, especially the longer they've been in, because prison teaches you that all relationships are transactional. What can I get out of you? And you want something out of me. And pretty much everybody that comes home from prison and starts with one of our teams has a hard time understanding that these are people that love you, not in spite of what you've done or not overlooking. We just love you because as a person, you deserve to be loved. And most of the time, 4 or 5 months into the experience, the partner, the person who's come home from prison will be like, well, why are these people doing this? You're paying them. And it's like, no, they're volunteers, they don't get paid. Or they're getting an award. There's an award at church, or there's an award in the community. That's why they're doing this. It's like, no, they're not doing it. Well, why are they doing this? Well, because they love you. Well, why do they love me? Well, because you deserve to be loved. Well, why do I deserve to be loved? And that's when we start to have really substantive discussions, is that we all should be loved. So, you know, how many of our folks have experienced solitary? It's a function of how long you have been in. The longer you have been in, the more likely you are to have had solitary at some point. We've had, in the last year, we've had a gentleman come home that went to prison in 1968.
Wow.
Think about what you were doing, if you were even alive in 1968.
Yeah, I was being born.
Yeah. We, and just recently we had a gentleman come home, went to prison in 1972. Yeah. So, and what's really sad, the guy who came home from 72, you know, when you talk about his experience, he spent a lot of time in solitary, because he went in, this is back when, you know, we thought that 16-year-olds were adults. And so he goes to prison as a teenager, and, you know, obviously doesn't like it. And, you know, once you get the reputation of you're a troublemaker, then anything you do gets you tossed in the hole. And so when he, you know, talks about his time since 72, the vast majority of the time he's been in solitary in one form or another.
Wow.
Yeah. And then we wonder why, when he comes out, he can't function, really struggles. I mean, he went to the county transition house, which, you know, thank you that Durham does have one. He went to the county transition house, and when I went to see him, his first couple of weeks there, he did not leave his room, because he couldn't get his mind around that I can leave this room and I can actually go outside.
Wow, that's powerful. A lot of wonderful comments in the chat box, information on implicit bias, if you want to learn more about that. And lots of comments about community compassion. I read about your organization, Drew, and how one of the gentlemen was tempted to reoffend, and he realized the people who have been surrounding him with love would be disappointed, so he didn't do it. You know, really, you've gotten some really nice coverage and good ways of explaining what you do. So be sure to check that out. Let's move right along now. We've got Susan. The torture question: is solitary confinement always torture? Are there circumstances where it could be appropriate?
No, I don't think there are circumstances where it's appropriate. I think we've got to be firm and bold about this. It can the terrible effects of solitary confinement can start immediately. And if you have a disability, if you have a mental illness, it's all the worse. We're talking about increased suicide, increased self-injurious behavior, increased mental illness if you weren't ill to begin with. So there's nothing useful about it. We know that there can be safe prisons without it, and it's only a negative for that person, a negative for the institution, for the people who work there, and for the community.
Right. I always do research before the shows, and I was interested to see that after just a few days, there could be damage to a person's mental health. Then I got to thinking about the study that came out a couple years ago about, in normal life on the outside, loneliness and isolation is terrible for your health. It's the health equivalent of smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. That's just being alone too much when you have your freedom. You know, that's, my goodness, the health outcomes of someone who's actually being tortured in this way. It's just unthinkable. Last question for Luke. What else do we need to know about solitary confinement and the justice system?
This might be one for everybody, because I'm probably going to miss things we talked about a lot today. I guess the one point that I really want to stress, given this is a NAMI presentation, is so many people end up in solitary as a result of infractions that are purely the symptoms of their mental illness. The system is not set up as we know it to understand the reason somebody did something, look into the reason that somebody did something. It's set up to punish behavior that is outside of the bounds of what they've defined. And very often it is the symptoms of mental illness that put people in solitary confinement. It is the worsening of those symptoms that keep them in solitary confinement. I mean, the great irony, right? And I think this is also just an example of, like Susie said, we've got to be firm and bold, really, with these Mandela rules and getting rid of solitary confinement of any kind for people with serious mental illness, because we have tried, DPS has tried half measures that aren't having effect. There's a behavioral analysis that happens during the infraction process where they're supposed to take mental health into effect and have somebody say, I think mental health affected this infraction, and say whether, I don't think this person should go into restrictive housing. That assessment can be ignored by the officer who's in charge of the disciplinary hearing if they feel like security concerns are involved. So we still see people getting infractions because of something that happened because of their mental health. Same thing with HCON, which is the unit Susie was talking about, which is the maximum security. Nobody with serious mental health issues is supposed to go to HCON unless the behavioral health director signs off on it. And we had that situation happen a couple weeks ago, where we tried to get the behavioral health director to not sign on, and they did, and the person went to HCON. So we need firm and absolute rules when it comes to this, because the minute those loopholes exist, that institutional pressure is going to keep things the way that they are. And I did want to mention, if I didn't, I know Drew talked about protective custody, just to have folks remember that, and this is a little bit theory, but I feel at least that the need for protective custody for folks really speaks to a failure of the prison system to maintain safe prisons. The fact that you have people willing to go into solitary confinement and who are so afraid they feel they need to stay there, to me means you don't have a secure and safe prison if so many people are choosing this and you feel the need to put people in there. So yeah, I think that's it, but anybody else who wants to add something to that, please do.
I would definitely to what you just said. That just goes to show that we need to start letting people go, because every time that I get a complaint and I call the prison, they're like, oh, we're sorry, we have short staff. So just like how my husband's life was jeopardized, you didn't have adequate enough staff to make sure that the guy that you weren't supposed to let out, who probably shouldn't even be in solitary confinement, but didn't want to come back out in general population for whatever the reason it is, probably because he's been institutionalized for so long, he feels so comfortable being in solitary confinement, that you're jeopardizing other people, because now he has been so mentally diminished that he's not able to even function for 10 minutes among individuals in general population. So imagine if we were to let him out and back on the streets, and then they're like, well, why is he out on the streets? Well, that's because DPS didn't do what they had to do to make sure that these people are taken care of mentally before they come back home. They just mass incarcerate them, torture them, and then put them back on the street for them to come right back and go through the same torture. And it's just like a never ending cycle. And so we have to really start thinking about how to move forward in the criminal justice system, because if you can't keep general population safe, then you definitely can't keep yourself safe, anybody else, or our community. So that means prison is not going to be the answer long term to keep mass incarcerating people. We have to do better with our communities.
We have a saying about the mental health system at NAMI that the system is broken, and I'm really hearing loud and clear that the prison system also is broken. Comment from Reverend Pam Goodine: we must look at ways to prevent people with mental illness from entering the criminal justice system. PVNC, Peer Justice Initiative, will be completing TOT for forensic peer support specialist trainers on March 4th. So you can get a training. Peer support specialist training is what is taking place within the prisons now. So there's a little ray of hope for us. Comment from Barbara Zatzau: agreeing with Sierra, we also need pre-prison community resources that could be utilized so people don't resort to crime in the first place. Well, yeah, there's a lot to be said for that. So much preventative medicine could be done and so much support if we could focus especially on diversity, equity, inclusion, and just level the playing field a little bit. That's my opinion, not NAMI's. Any other thoughts about what we should know before we move on to our video of the week? And then we'll take questions from members of the virtual studio audience. All right, very good. We're going to wrap up the interview portion. Before we go to our video of the week, a big shout out to our heroes working behind the scenes diligently to make this show come together. Intern Paulina Mendez on chat, psychiatric nurse Gail Pruitt on Facebook, and all the folks who are out there listening, participating with your comments. I really appreciate your being here. And of course, our deepest thanks to our panelists for spending your evening, your insights, your expertise with us. It means a lot. So I'm going to pull up the video of the week, and someone from Disability Rights is going to give a little intro because they provided this awesome video testimony.
I can do that. This is a video of a person who's been out of prison about 6 months. He was 17 when he went to prison, and he's 30 years old now. So that's 13 years. He was released directly from solitary confinement in August to the community, and he's done a great job of securing employment, complying with his conditions of release, going to all of his sessions that he's required to go to, all on his own, basically. Reentry support is really hard to put together. I'm so glad to hear about Drew's organization in Durham, but that's not typical. This person also is a person with mental illness, and he shared his experience in solitary confinement.
All right, thank you for that. He's very articulate and courageous, I agree. Here we go.
So we were locked down for chow due to COVID, and we usually come out for day room after chow, and we were still locked down after chow. So I was questioning, you know, why we were still locked down. They popped me out for meds. I went to the med window. I spoke to the CO. The CO at the med window said that he would speak to the OIC. The OIC came and locked me up with another inmate who said nothing at all, who was only getting his meds. And escorted me to SEG and told me on my way to SEG that, you know, he would make sure that I got ICON. You know, he would make sure that I got 180 days on restrictive housing for control purposes, which I didn't take seriously because I hadn't done anything and I knew that I didn't do anything. After a couple of months go by, you know, especially if you're in there for long term, you know, 180 days or more, you know, 90 days or more, after the first couple of months, depending on what you experience, you know, different things start to happen because I guess your mind is trying to compensate for the stimulation that it's not getting. And, you know, I dealt with some trauma in my past. I dealt with some trauma in, you know, the prison system and the institutions itself. And so me personally, you know, I was hearing things, you know, like just COs walking up stairs and, you know, I come to my door and, you know, nobody's out there and, you know, people walking by the door and, you know, I come to the cell window and I look and nobody's out there. I experienced, you know, just staring for long periods of time at the wall, at the door, at the toilet, and sometimes it would seem like, you know, things were moving or things were disproportionate, like bubbling, and, you know, just hearing different screams and sounds in my head at night before I was going to sleep. I experienced extreme paranoia, like, you know, like I was going to die, like somebody was going to come into my cell and attack me. You know, I felt a presence that wasn't there. It's a lot of things that, you know, I myself and other people go through in solitary confinement. As far as just sitting there for so long, stationary in one place, and not having an outlet to, you know, just occupy your mind, you know, when you're thinking too much. So.
That is so, so powerful. My goodness, how courageous of him to share all that he was going through. I just found that amazing. All right, well, now it's time to take questions from members of our virtual studio audience on Zoom and Facebook. If you're new to Zoom Q&A, you want to look for the conversation bubble towards the bottom left of your screen. All right, question from Desiree. We'll jump right in. Hello, everyone. Given the difficulty in getting changes made, is there a centralized source of resistance in getting the changes made, or is the issue more of a structural resistance?
I address that a little bit. I think it's a cultural problem. There were people at one point who wanted to make changes. As I mentioned, this Commissioner Geis actually ended solitary confinement for the 15, 16, and 17-year-olds that we used to place in prison frequently and less so now. And he started CIT training, wall to wall into prison, which was really having an impact to de-escalate things rather than escalate problems. We got some money for those therapeutic diversion units that I mentioned, although they're not enough. But the problem is it's a big ship that needs to turn, and it's a big cultural change that needs to happen, and it takes leadership, dedicated leadership. So I don't think it's just one person probably, but we need Governor Cooper to take a stand. We need him to implement the task force recommendations and bring a committee together, shine a light on what's happening in North Carolina, and then fix it, solve it, so that we're doing better for people and for our communities.
Other thoughts? All right, thank you for that answer. I think you covered that well. The second note is, for the record, this was Adam Shaw, not Desiree. So thank you for clarifying who that was, and thank you for your question. Question from Gail. This is a tough one, kind of. What is the racial composition of the guards in most prisons in North Carolina? Anyone want to take a stab at that? We might need to get back with you on that one, Gail.
Yeah, Gail, I saw that before and I was trying to think if we had ever looked at that, and I'm not sure that we have, so don't think we can give you an answer.
Okay. That one down for Google later. With such, also from Gail, with such devastating effects of solitary confinement, where do you even begin to form a relationship with someone who's been released from prison?
Storytelling. We sit around in a circle and we tell our stories.
That is so healing.
Pen pals.
Oh yeah.
Pen pals.
We try and offer hope when we hear from people. Let them know about, the expert opinions, about advocacy that's going on, including with NAMI. Disability Rights has partnered with NAMI and other mental health advocacy organizations for 10 years to try and impact this. And I think it seems to be that people just learning that other people care, other people are watching, can give some hope.
Yeah. Sierra, could you repeat the answer that you gave to that question? How do you begin that relationship? I didn't quite catch it.
Pen pal, writing.
Ah, got it. Thank you. Yeah, writing helps. Journaling, pen paling.
Mm-hmm. And I would say the peer support organizations that we see sort of growing around North Carolina are a huge help. We can, give folks local reentry resources, everything like that, but that's really not nearly as powerful as somebody who has been through it before, come out of it, been trained as a peer support counselor, and now can help you. I mean, especially, and I know folks are working on this, trying to get peer support folks into jails and prisons before folks are released to try and build that relationship before that happens. So yeah, can't speak highly enough of those organizations and the work that they do to just help folks, rejoin their communities after such traumatic experience.
Yeah, peer support is an amazing tool, and NAMI does a lot of peer support, not as a certified peer support structure, but our support groups are all peer-led, peer-driven, and it's a really special thing to have everyone in the room be able to say me too, whether it's mental health, being justice involved, whatever your burden is. Comments and a question from Barbara Z. Thank you to all the panelists and everyone working towards social justice for all. And she's, again, thank you. It's amazing that any of you were given access to North Carolina solitary confinement areas. Did you visit all of them throughout the state? Different geographic levels, different security levels, et cetera. And what legal safeguards are actually taking place to protect people in segregated housing? Maybe you covered that already.
We, Luke and I have been in because we are Disability Rights North Carolina is the protection and advocacy system for North Carolina. That's created by Congress. They created a nationwide network of protection and advocacy systems and gave us a toolbox that includes the right and the duty to go into places where people are receiving services, including prisons and jails, and make sure that they are not being neglected or abused. So it's unique. There's one PNA in every state, and we're very grateful to have this job and to have this assignment. The disability, it's a true from birth to death, we like to say. So we have an education team. We have a team that works on keeping people safe in their home. We have a team that investigates, and then we have this very small criminal justice team and we're trying to have an impact.
All of the panelists are doing amazing work, as I said before. Two similar questions, so I'm going to read them back to back. What more can we do to mobilize to hold our system accountable for the unbridled abuse of those in solitary confinement? And the other question, what can the average person do to get involved in your work? Can you provide action items? So.
Well, for our end, I would say getting involved. There are several sort of national anti-solitary campaigns going on right now. We're involved with Unlock the Box, who are trying to get really public support going in North Carolina for anti-solitary movements. Also just if you really want something at your local level that can help, all of your sheriffs in North Carolina are up for re-election in 2022. Now, the sheriffs don't control prisons. They do control jail and jail policy, especially as it comes to, diversions. Sierra was talking about the need to depopulate the prisons, and part of that we're hoping are these diversion programs. And by that, I mean programs that recognize people who are in mental health and substance use crisis, divert them away from the justice system and into care. There are several pilot programs in North Carolina. There's been ones run across the country with great success. So seeing that's a good thing to learn about at the local level, where really, your vote is going to count, a whole lot more when it's your sheriff, because it's just a smaller voting base. And yeah, getting involved with Unlock the Box or really any of the local campaigns against solitary. I know many churches, have them, really just trying to get involved that way, because, the average person can't, bring a court case or might not have the access into solitary, but what you can do is try and sort of become aware and become at least active enough to talk about it to your friends and neighbors, because really the idea being that we'll eventually reach a tipping point where enough people know about it and enough people are honestly angry about it and want to see it change, that local officials who have the power to change it are going to have to take notice. So that's just, general things that I can think of right now to help get involved.
Blow up your governor's email. Josh Stein and your governor definitely blow up their email and voice your opinion of your taxpayer, and you want to see change, and you want to see innovation in the prison system, and you want solitary confinement gone. As far as what the community can do to help, peer support, take peer support training, and be one of those that's able to go in the prisons, because we don't have the mental health capacity right now like we would like to go in the prisons and give them the mental services they need. So just having a peer support, somebody that can come in and talk to them once a week, twice a week, just to sit down and listen. You don't have to say anything, you just listen to them. I think that could really help, joining in and trying to help, as well as just letting your legislative people know that you no longer want to be a part of that train and something else needs to happen.
So there's several things you can do if you're interested in reentry. My email is in the chat. We're glad to come talk to your church or organization about the challenges in reentry. If you want to be a little more involved in that, one of the things we provide for folks coming home in the Durham area is we provide a welcome home box. That's a month's worth of toiletries, about a week's worth of food, a resource guide, $25 gift certificate so you can buy underwear, because when I came home, I had one pair of underwear, which is not great. So some money so somebody can come take you, bring you some underwear. And if you're really motivated, give me a holler at me and we'll talk about being on a team. Outside of that, organize. If you're in Durham can. Sister organizations exist in Wake, in Orange County, in Charlotte. Organize around candidates for judge, for DA, because there's so much power in the DA's office and what they decide to charge and how they decide to charge. Organize around state and state Senate and state House races. Organize. Get people to the polls. When you look at how many people vote in our primaries, it's embarrassing. If we voted as much as we're willing to talk about change, we would have change. The problem is we're willing to talk about it. We're not really willing to get out and vote about it. So get out, organize, go vote. And if we vote in people who are willing to advocate for change, we'll have change.
All right, again, we've got some wonderful links in the chat box. Those are great questions, and we're getting some great answers. Anyone else want to speak to how people can get involved with advocacy or work on this issue?
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Susie.
Well, I was going to say, if they go to the DRNC website and click on campaigns, they'll see our campaign about this, and there's a place to send in your information, and we'll keep in touch with you.
Yeah, and to Drew's point about local officials, the judge, the DA, the sheriff, those are the people who really have huge control over the jails. And I know we talked a lot about the prison system. The jail system is separate, but there are certainly people who spend more than 15 days in solitary in a jail, as well as the prison. So you can have a direct effect on that locally, because all of our county jails are all run by the county. So that, yeah, the judges, the DA, the sheriff have a lot of power in that.
Yes, and local elections are this year. So your judge and your DA and sheriff are this year. So y'all get out and vote, and please educate yourself on your local DA, because like they said, the DA has so much power, and they're the ones that give your loved ones the time, and they can at any time take that charge back if they really decide that they want to. So please go and educate yourselves on the DA and the sheriff's race for this year and place your vote.
All right, a lot of sound suggestions there. I think whatever your skills, your time commitment ability, there's something there that you can do. So thank you for all those great ideas. I'm going to make some quick announcements. We just had another question pop up in the Q&A, which is exciting. Next week, please join us. We've got a wonderful speaker, Matthew Ho. He's a disabled Marine Corps veteran. He's had a long and winding road to recovery. He's been through so many things, a traumatic brain injury, other invisible injuries, thanks to his service during the Iraq War and 10 full years as a Marine. He was unable to work for 5 years as a result of these difficulties, but he's kind of rebooted and come back strong. Come and hear his story. He's a great speaker. Please fill out our survey when you leave this Zoom program. A survey monkey image will magically appear. It's very brief. Let us know how we did, how we could improve. It helps us keep our funding over time, and it helps us improve over time. If you would like to be a speaker on Thursdays with NAMI, again, take the survey. Let me know your name and contact information. I'd love to learn more about you. All right. Oh, interesting question from John Klein. Are North Carolina prisons private for-profit enterprises? And if they are, what effect does that have?
No, we don't. We toyed with some private prisons and some out-of-state prisons in the 90s. Wasn't very successful, so we don't employ private prisons. There are some programming that are done by GEO, which is a private prison industry. So sometimes there might be a blur, a little bit of a blur.
Yeah, there are certainly, still folks making, we don't have private prisons, but there are still certainly people making money off of prison labor.
Well, there's one private prison left. There's one private prison.
Oh, okay.
Bertie. Well, Bertie's a private prison.
I misspoke then.
Yeah, they're still around, unfortunately.
And what's the name of it? Bertie?
Bertie Correctional. It's private.
Well, thank you for that. Interesting. Wow, there's so much to learn about justice. As I was researching and preparing for this show, I just realized how complex it is and how many things there are to follow up on and study. Do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with us? We're coming up on 8:30, not quite there yet.
Just for people to educate themselves about solitary confinement and join us in the march to abolish our solitary confinement and hopefully change the way that our prisons are running from here on out, that we can be more innovative and get people the help that they need and not punish them for the help that they're needing and not getting.
Yeah, to try and end on a hopeful note, we have the benefit of living in a time where we have a lot of foundation for the movement against solitary. We have 30 years of pretty much uninterrupted psychological studies about the damages it can do. That is translated into fairly good, case law to cite. We have movements that we can point to internationally and across the United States of why this is torturous and unnecessary. So really, now is really the time for public involvement and to really push that and try and reach a tipping point in terms of how we think about solitary confinement, and to really try and change the culture within the prisons that's keeping it in place when we all pretty much know how horrible it is.
Susan, Drew?
Go vote.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Go vote.
Go vote.
Go vote. Until we change the legislature, it's hard to get real lasting change.
Yeah, and we would like people to write to us to give us their address and their contact information so that we can build a momentum that we evidently need to make a change.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sierra, Drew, Susan, Luke, for all that you've done. You've spoken from the heart and you've shared a lot of the argument, the cases to be made, the research, and I can just tell that you're all so effective. I'm glad that you're out there giving a voice to people who don't have a voice. Your work is so important, and I want to really honor that. Thanks to everyone else for being here. Those of us who joined via Zoom or Facebook, we appreciate you being here so much. Remember, if you're feeling alone, please reach out to NAMI. Join a free support group, take one of our free classes, be part of a community where people understand we're all in this together, dealing with difficult issues personally, as a community, as a world. But I think we can get through it if we stick together. Thanks everyone for being here. Have a good night.
Thanks.